Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the lab. I think it's about time I get a bit more technical, a bit more scientific about these diagnoses. I'm just sort of straightening up the desk while I introduce this and trying to retrieve things that seem to have gone underneath there. I was looking back at the videos I've shot so far. I haven't released it all yet. But what I'm realizing is that in the recent past, the last few years, repairs that I've done on electronics have mostly been televisions, like LCD televisions and computer monitors. And in those cases, most of the time, the common failure point is the capacitors. And that seems to be my go-to. That's been my go-to. Because you look at the capacitors, you can see which ones have exploded, and you can pretty much figure just replace all the capacitors and you'll probably get your functionality back. And 9 times out of 10, that's been what's happened. Not on these projects, though. So, first one I'm going to attack on this sort of revised look at things is the subwoofer, which I'm picking up right now. And there we go. As other things decide to fall. So the first thing I got to do on this is actually take all these screws out. I got to find a place to put them. I don't want to put them in that box. I'll have to find another box in a minute, but I don't like losing track of the screws. But I'm going to go ahead and remove all these screws, and I will come back when I've got that done. Okay, I'm back. We're into the last screw here, and I also wanted to mention, I think I may have figured out why the color kept shifting. I apologize for that in the earlier videos. It's just a white balance thing, and it was set on auto, and every time I kind of stuck my hands in the frame, the color would shift, and that was just annoying. So I've now locked it. I've also rotated the speaker, so you're kind of looking at it a little bit differently. Ultimately, what I want to do here, just as a first step, and I'm going to do this, like I said, more methodically. Oops, I missed a screw. I'm going to do it more methodically. I'm going to start at the actual power source, the 120 volts coming in. And one thing I haven't explored in these videos is the fact that there's I think I may have mentioned it, that there's a transformer in here. And I kind of flipped it around. Maybe I'm hoping you can see the transformer back here. That is what's basically, the power is coming in and going down to that transformer and coming back up into this cable here. Am I out of frame? I'm out of frame. Let me see if I can't rotate you a little bit better. Okay, so I was trying to say before I realized I'm completely out of frame doing most of that, is there is a transformer down here. And there's a cable coming off of that transformer. I think it's a multi-tap transformer that has multiple voltages coming out of it. And that comes into this cable here, which I am now going to disconnect somewhat ungracefully. I'm going to leave this off to the side because what I want to know is what voltages are coming out of this cable. That will give me some sort of clue as to what else might be going on here. I can start tracing from there. So the next thing I need is a voltmeter to measure, of course, volts. Now I'm assuming for the moment that what's coming out of there, actually it's a transformer, so odds are what's coming out of there is actually AC. Now I don't have a low voltage AC option here below 200, and I'm hoping that it's not more than 200. But the other thing I got to do is plug this sucker in. Now keep in mind what's happening, the symptom is that after it has a bit of time to warm up, I start getting a hum again. So I'm trying to figure out why I'm getting a hum. There's got to be a component that's heating up or a component that's being interfered with. The heating up reasoning is because it takes a little time before it actually starts to give me trouble. So now I've plugged it in. Is that plugged in? I don't want to give it a shock or create other issues. All right. That is plugged in. Now I got to figure out, because I can't really see what's going on with that transformer. One of these is probably somewhat of a common, and I notice that there's, I'm hoping that comes through, there's 2 blues, 2 blacks, and 2 reds. I'm going to assume for the moment that the black is the common. And oh, and the fact that there's a switch on here to turn it on and off on the main board doesn't really matter, because the power is going straight down to the transformer, coming straight up this cable. This board is not in play yet. So it's all in this cable. And I just want to know what kind of voltages we're dealing with here. And are we dealing with 120? Are we dealing with 12? Let me actually move this display up. Let me just make sure that's in frame. I'm trying to figure out how to get it in frame for you there. Is that, yeah, that's probably a little bit better. All right. So I've got, if I go with one of the black, well, let's actually compare. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, okay. So only the one black. Here's the first red. That is coming up at 35.2 AC. The other one's coming up at 35.2 AC. Now if I go to the other side, I'm getting 19.6, if I'm reading that right. I'm having a little bit of a problem keeping these probes held on. So 19.6, yep. And the other one, also 19.6. I'm guessing that what's going on here is the 2 blue cables are basically the same voltage, but it's so that they can move more current. They're using 2 cables. So the only thing left is to see if, in fact, yeah, I want to test one more voltage. It's just going from blue to red to see if there's a connection there. We're going to add this to the data that we've collected on this. I'm trying not to get myself shocked while I'm doing it. That's blue to red. 15.1 volts. The other blue. Now that's interesting. The other blue to red is giving me 55.6 volts. That's if I'm counting from the blue through the red. So if the first blue is pin 1, that was giving me, let's do this. Blue to blue, nothing. No voltage. That kind of makes sense. Blue to black, 19.6, that matches. So I'm going from 1 to 2, then 1 to 3 there, and then 1 to 4 gives me 15.1, and 1 to 5 is giving me 55.5 or 6. Call it 55.55. Now if I go from the other blue, blue to black, 19.6, blue to red, 55.7, and second blue, or pin 2 to pin 5, is 15.2. So I'm going to have to diagram all of that out. If I go from black, all it remains in terms of combinations is black. Black to the first red is 35.5, and black to the second red is also 35.5. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure that's the same numbers I got earlier, but the only thing left would be go red to red, and there is actually a difference there. 71.7 volts. Wow, that's different. But I believe that's all the combinations. I'll come back if that's not all of them. But I'm going to go now watch this video, diagram it out, create a diagram from it so I can figure out what all those voltages are. And that'll be the first step in terms of trying to trace all of this and figure out what in the world is going on. Those are some reasonably high voltages. I mean, they're not 6,000 volts or something like that, but they're more than the 5 or the 12 volts or something that you might expect from a lower power circuit. This is, of course, a subwoofer, which needs to have a fair amount of current running through it. And, oh, the other thing I wanted to test, I'm going to unplug it. And I'm going to test for continuity between those pins. I want to see if those pins are actually supposed to be connected. Or, I mean, effectively connected. I can't look inside the transformer. I don't want to tear it apart. Looks like we got continuity between 1 and 2. Let me... 1.4, 1.5 ohms, so continuity would be about the same. Yeah, there's a little bit of induction or something in there, or reactance, I guess you call it. But 1 and 2 appear to be connected. 1 and 3 appear to be connected. 1 and 4. 1 and 5. Wow, that's interesting. These are not all isolated from each other. I wonder if that could be an issue. 2 to 3, continuity. 2 to 4, continuity. 2 to 5, continuity. 3 to 4, continuity. 3 to 5, continuity. And finally, 4 to 5, continuity. So everything has some degree of a connection to each other, but that might not mean anything. That could well be that you've got, that's all on the secondary of the transformer, and you've got multiple turns in a coil with taps in the middle of the coil. So really it's just a piece of wire and everything's connected. So I think I've kind of resolved that. It is actually normal, I believe, for that to happen. But I'm going to use that data. I'm going to go sit and think it through. I've actually got some video to edit, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it all down. I'm going to work on editing so I can release some of these videos, and then while they are processing, I will sit and try and think this one through. So that's the first step in trying to get serious and scientific about figuring out what's going on. Okay, I'm going in with the video light on, and hopefully we can capture something. I can see a label. Just don't know if I can actually get a shot of it. Transtech. All right, there we go. Okay, folks, it took me a while to wrap my head around what was going on. Here's the numbers I wrote down from what I just went through with you on video. I went back and played back the video and wrote down, it was the first set of numbers, which I'm not sure how much I trust that, so I got a question mark on that. I got my little diagram with blue, black, and red, so I know what the pins are. So I've got some reference that I can go by to start tracing this thing down. But then the trick was, how do I take this set of numbers, that last set of numbers that I kind of read off, where from pins 1 to 2 there was 0, from 1 to 3 it was 19.6, 1 to 4 it was 15.1 volts, it just a lot of different numbers here. And if you start trying to figure out if they were lined up in order 1 through 5, it doesn't make any sense at all. So it took me a while to sort of wrap my head around it. And what I finally decided was, okay, let's think about this logically. If it was all on, if it's only, how can I describe this? A transformer is basically a set of coils, and they're inducing voltage from one side to the other. So you've got a coil on one side, it's 120 volts, and you got, say, a coil on the other side. In the simplest form, you have a 12 volt coil, and you accomplish that by saying maybe there's 10 turns, well, say maybe 100 turns on the 120 volt side and only 10 turns on the 12 volt side, so it's a 10-to-1 ratio, and it reduces the voltage from 120 down to 12. That's all in AC, and this is transformers are AC. You want DC, you end up running it through something called a rectifier, which converts it from AC to DC, and then you can run it through a voltage regulator to get the voltages you want. Or, if you want to get more complicated, you can build a transformer with multiple windings, not just 2, but 3 or 4 windings, or even more, depending on how complex you want to get. And my fear was that what they were doing was, there was the 120 volt side, and then that's what we call a primary. On the secondary side, the question is, was it just one secondary coil, or were there multiple coils that were being induced by the 120 volt side? And I know this is getting kind of technical, but just to sort of give you an idea, if you had 100 turns on the primary side and you had 2 separate coils, one at, say, 10 turns and one at 20 turns, on the secondary side, or we can call it secondary and tertiary, but that's getting technical. Just imagine if you had 100 turns on one side, you have 10 turns and 20 turns on the other side. That 10 turns would be a 10-to-1 ratio, so 12 volts. That 20 turns would be a 5-to-1 from 100 down to 20. So you'd have 24 volts coming out of that. So you could have a 12 volt and a 24 volt. But more likely what they do when you want to have both 12 volts and 24 volts, for example, is you put 100 turns on the primary side, you put 20 turns on the secondary side, and you have a center tap halfway through. So you've got 20 turns, but at the 10 turn point, you have a little wire coming off of it. So at that point, you can have a 12 volt and a 24 volt off of the same coil. This is what they call a multi-tap coil. At least that's my understanding. If somebody wants to correct my terminology, please go ahead in the comments down below. Go ahead and do that. But what I was looking at was, okay, if I'm lucky, what we've got here is a single coil with multiple taps on it. And it's just, we've got these 5 pins coming off of it. 2 of those pins are going to be on the outside ends of the coil. And the other 3 pins would be in the middle, hopefully, or maybe they've got 2 pins that are actually just connected to the same point on the coil. That's what I was thinking when they had blue, blue, black, red, red. I was thinking, oh, okay, we got 2 on one end, 2 on the other end, and 1 in the middle. No, it doesn't work out that way. Ultimately, what I came up with was this diagram. What I ended up realizing was, if you have multiple taps, you got to have at some point the outer ends of that coil. And the outer ends of that coil are going to be the largest voltage. And if we go back and we look, what I'm thinking is the 71.95 that I read, which is between 4 and 5, pins 4 and 5, was the largest number. So I said, okay, what if we make pins 4 and 5 the outside? Not 1 and 5 as I was originally hoping. If we make 4 and 5 the outside, then we look at the next largest voltage, which comes in between 1 and 5 and 2 and 4. And I'm like, okay, now wait a minute, that doesn't make sense because I got 4 and 5 on the outside. Then I realized, okay, if I put 1 up next to the 4 and 2 up next to the 5, and then I actually look at the the connection between them here, basically the widest possible, the longest possible length on that coil gets us the next highest voltage. And those both come in at roughly 55.5. So that's why I've marked them as 55.5. I was trying to figure out how it all adds up, and it's close. It's not perfect, but it's close. And that could come down to my meter not being perfect. So I'm assuming here then that from 1 to 5 is 55.5 volts. From 2 to 4 is 55.5 volts, and it would lay out nicely like this. That got me 1, 2, 4, and 5. That left pin 3. What do we do with the black wire pin? And I said, well, let's try sticking it in the middle and see what happens. So I stuck it in the middle, and if you now go between 2 and 3, you get roughly 20 volts. I had 19.6. I'm going to call it 20 now. And between 1 and 3, you're also getting 19.6 or 20 volts. Then what remains in terms of the voltages, I'm working my way down the voltages. Actually, I haven't talked about 35.5 yet, but we'll get to that in a minute. Then you got the 15.1 volt or 15.2, which is, we'll call it 15 volts. What we have, if we go 1 to 3 gives us 20 volts, and if 1 to 4 gives us 15 volts, then 3 to 4, which we have here on the diagram, is 35.5 volts. Basically, we're talking 20 plus 15 equals 35 volts. Now it all kind of falls into place, because then 2 to 5 should be 15 volts. Sure enough, 2 to 5 came up around 15 volts. So I think this is how this is laid out. And this is an assumption because I don't have a diagram for the actual transformer. I am going to attempt to take a picture inside the cabinet of the transformer and see if I can find any markings and see if I can look it up and see if I can corroborate this. But otherwise, I've got something to start with. This is part of tracing out the circuit. It's a mess because it's a multi-tap transformer or a multi-turn or multi-coil, whatever you want to call it, transformer. There's a lot of connections coming out of this transformer and multiple voltages coming out. Now that I kind of have this, and I know what the voltages are between certain pins, I can now start tracing the circuit board from the pins on and see what kind of voltages should be across those pins, and then see what components are connected across those pins and start to try and figure out what may have gone bad. Now, I know this was a long explanation, but it was a tricky thing to go through and figure out, and I wanted to give you sort of my approach to figuring out a mystery transformer and how it gets its voltages. This is my guess for the time being until I can prove otherwise, but it's enough information, I think, for me to go on and start tracing this circuit. So my apologies for the length of this, but now we can move forward.